You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. Today we will talk about prisons and whether to abolish them. Our special and returning guest is Professor Rebecca Ginsburg of the University of Illinois. She's working on an abolitionist reader. As always, we begin with prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, is it true that prisons keep us safe?
I think that they don't keep us as safe as other approaches that we might use. And I think they fail to keep us as safe as they themselves might promise to do. And I want to explain that a little bit more. Prisons are holding places, holding pens, warehouses, some people have called them, for individuals who have been convicted of crimes. Insofar as people have been excluded from society, lifted from streets and from communities and from family homes, and are no longer able to interact with people on what they call the outside world, there is obviously a measure of incapacitation at work here. These individuals are being incapacitated, just as I would be incapacitated if I were locked up in a prison, and I would be less able to harm people in the outside world from that position. So there's a bit of logical incapacitation at work here. But so much research has taught us that prisons in themselves are criminogenic. Criminogenic means what it sounds like it means. Like carcinogenic means tending to produce cancer. Criminogenic means tending to produce crime, which is to say that people who are incarcerated in prisons are more likely than people similarly situated who have not been incarcerated in prisons to engage in harmful activity and wrongdoing and criminal activity upon release. So one way that some people have talked about prisons is actually as a factory for producing increased level of harm, increased levels of violence, both within the prisons and outside of them. So if we look at the bigger picture, and if we think of the criminogenic nature of incarceration, then it's clear that by their presence, through the ways in which they operate, prisons in the long term do not keep us safer. There's also another way in which prisons don't keep us safe. And that is in that prisons remove from our communities individuals who might otherwise be fulfilling roles in those communities that would have safety enhancing features. For example, no one person is simply a criminal, someone who has committed an act of harm or act of violence. That same individual is a father or a mother or an aunt or a grandmother, is a church member, is a Boy Scout leader, is a teacher. And what we find in communities that are most impacted by incarceration, and those tend, of course, to be, of course, given the nature of American society, to be predominantly minority, poor neighborhoods, economically and politically disenfranchised and marginalized neighborhoods, what we find is that the absence of disproportionate numbers of adults from those neighborhoods, adults that might otherwise be parenting or mentoring or simply keeping eyes on the street, that acts of harm doing and violence tend to increase in those neighborhoods, in part due to the absence of adults from those neighborhoods. So in that way as well, we can think as prisons as indirectly contributing to harm and violence. The third way I want to respond to that question, and this will be the last way, because I could keep on responding to the same question, but I want to put out three of the main ways in which prisons do not keep us safe. I want to think about what we mean by us. And if by us we mean humans, not just those of us on the outside who are fortunate enough not to be in prison, but all of us, including those of us who are in prison. We're all us. Then prisons clearly do not keep us safe, because prisons are not safe environments. Prisons are notoriously violent environments. They're physically violent, they're emotionally violent, they're traumatic environments. And the people who are in prison, whether they're incarcerated there or whether they're employed there, are subject to higher levels of violence and of trauma. And there are so many ways in which this is reflected. It's reflected, for instance, in the high level of suicide among correctional officers. It's reflected in the high levels of domestic abuse on the part of the correctional officers, which is to say that correctional officers are more likely, disproportionately and complicit in directing domestic abuse or intimate partner abuse towards their loved ones in the outside world. It's reflected in the high levels of suicide and self-harm among incarcerated people. Prisons don't keep the people who live and work in prisons safe. And if that were 3 people, it would be matter for concern. But it's not 3 people, it's millions of people, millions and millions of people. You know, at the height of the prison boom, what I hoped was the height of his prison boom about 10 years ago, it was 1 out of every 100 Americans. So to subject 1 out of every 100 Americans to be incarcerated, not mentioning the staff, to those levels of violence is not keeping them safe. And I and many other people who call themselves abolitionists are hopeful and optimistic and persuaded that we can do better.
You certainly set forth a case for abolition. Mario, you want to pick up on that?
Well, precisely, you mentioned about other approaches. If prisons don't make us safe, what would be the alternative? Or one alternative?
Well, thank you for asking. Here's a way of thinking about it. When prisons were invented, they're an invention, like so many other things, like washing machines and lights. Prisons are an invention, and prisons were invented. The modern prison was invented in England in the 18th century. And when it was invented, it was not meant to replace what had happened before. It was meant to crowd out a little of what had happened before. Let me explain. Prior to the invention of the prisons, the dominant ways of responding to criminal wrongdoing in England and in much of Western Europe was through corporal punishment, through capital punishment, through fines. Corporal punishment included branding and whipping and the stocks and the pillories, things that we know from movies and so on. Capital punishment was of particular concern to many progressives in England. And fines were monetary levies that were that accused convicted individuals had to pay for particular crimes. So the prison was not meant to replace all of that. Prisons were meant to crowd out the use of capital punishment in particular. There are many people who felt there were too many capital crimes. England was killing too many of its own. So the idea was that in lieu of capital punishment, people convicted of particularly serious crimes would be sentenced instead to what they considered long-term incarceration in those days, 7 years, 10 years. That was what they thought of long-term incarceration. Why do I mention that? Because I'm not speaking for all abolitionists, but I will say that my understanding, most other abolitionists as well, do not have an idea that there will be a replacement that replaces prisons, that will step in the footprint of prisons and replace it completely, just as prisons did not step in the footprint of the pre-existing responses to criminal wrongdoing and replace it completely. Instead, what I, many others, imagine is that there will be alternative approaches that in different jurisdictions crowd out the use of penal incarceration, such that there becomes less and less a desire or an interest or a conviction that it's the right approach. Similarly to how prisons were imagined, it was originally imagined that prisons would work back in the day. So I can give you some ideas of what some of those alternative approaches might be. But I used that very long preface because I wanted to make myself clear that my vision and the vision of so many others is not that we will plant these alternative approaches down where the prisons are. They will take the place entirely of prisons. The millions of people now in prison will be subject to these alternative approaches instead. That's not the idea. It seems impractical and strategically unwise to proceed in that fashion. What looks much more promising, and what gets me really excited, are all of the experiments, and I think it's fair to call them experiments, all of them pilot projects, all of the initiatives that are taking place in jurisdictions across the country, not to mention the rest of the world, but let's just keep it to this country. There are so many different models of restorative justice, for example, from Oakland, California. You guys are in Southern California, in Oakland, California, Miami, of all places. Well, I say of all places because Miami, New York, of course, Washington, D.C. I mean, there's so many different models of restorative justice. And I can talk more about restorative justice if you like. There are different models of transformative justice. There are, just to lay out a couple of examples, there are some jurisdictions in which the court gives to a party before the court, the accused and the putative victim of an offense, the option to pursue one of these alternative, we call them alternative right now, courses. There are other jurisdictions in which the neighborhood structures, the community structures are such that parties to an act of harm or wrongdoing don't even get to court. They instead are shuttled right away into one of these alternative systems. So those are different approaches right there, right? And you can see the benefits, the pros and the cons of both of those approaches. One of the other, and then I'll provide this third other sort of school of alternative approaches to incarceration, and then I'll stop talking and let you guys respond to me, are those that aim to address the range of forces and factors that often, not always, give rise to harm and violence in the first place. There are so many reasons people hurt each other and hurt themselves, and we can't begin to understand or exhaust them.
Yeah.
That's all right, Professor Ginsburg. I had to shoo 3 or 4 parakeets out of this room.
We put him in the back when the mailman is about to come because he protects the house from the mailman. Yeah, he's a good boy. What's he saying?
Well, I think your first respondent, and you'd mentioned Southern California, is a former Southern California person. Christopher Zehnder, who lived in Tehachapi, knows something about prisons, but at any rate, he's now in Ohio. So Christopher, you want to take this forward as a former SoCal guy?
Well, yeah, a mutual friend of ours, Charles Coulombe, whenever he would call me when I was in Tehachapi, he would say, "May I speak to the warden?" Because if you probably know,
Charles has a highly unusual sense of humor. And I ask you, how many of your friends wear spats?
Anyway, maybe a point of clarification. I was thinking that I think a lot of the difficulty people might have in understanding maybe your argument where you're coming from, the abolition of prisons, has to do with what they might perceive to be the purpose of the justice system, of which prisons form a part. So what are we doing what are we supposed to be doing when we're imprisoning people? What were we supposed to be doing when we were flogging people? What is the whole point? What is the purpose of this what we call punishment?
I love that question. And, I can't remember if you're a philosopher, Christopher, but whatever you are, you know that there's no answer to that. You especially know there's no answer if you're a philosopher because they refuse to answer things.
We call Christopher Morph Man. He's taken many forms.
You're right in pointing out that at different times in different places, public officials, courts, legislators, thought leaders, philosophers have presented as true and right different reasons for responding to wrongdoing. In some eras, it's all about incapacitation. In some historical periods, it's all about deterrence. In some historical periods, it's all about retributivism, right? Or an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We went through a period, we in the United States in the mid 20th century went through a strong period of corrections, of rehabilitation. We're going to put those other purposes aside, and prisons are going to be all about rehabilitating individuals. That's why so many prisons in the United States, well, not all of them, are called correctional facilities right now. There's no answer. There's only what we decide. Let me tell you how I respond to that question. And I think many other abolitionists do as well. But again, I'm not speaking for all of them. I'm speaking for myself. I very purposely choose my words: respond to wrongdoing, response to violence, instead of punishment. I use that phraseology instead of the term punish, because I don't believe that punish is an appropriate response to wrongdoing or harm or violence. I don't think we should be aiming to punish individuals. I think we should do as you're suggesting and step back and ask, harm, wrongdoing, pain, suffering, hurt. What is our role here as a society when we see these things? And in particular, when we are aware that an individual is responsible for having hurt another individual or a group of individuals, of having caused harm, what is the healthiest, most compassionate, most useful way in which to intervene? I would hold that the most useful and healthy and compassionate way to intervene is not by punishing the individual, but to seek to understand what gave rise to the harm in the first place, and then to address those causes, address those factors. I'm sort of quoting Howard Zierer here, who's considered one of the primary philosophers of restorative justice. He says the aim of restorative justice is to repair the harms, address the harms revealed by any act of wrongdoing. And I think that's a very appropriate way to think about it. Our current criminal justice system takes a very small microscope and looks at the parties has a very narrow understanding of the parties to any particular act of wrongdoing or harm. There's the perpetrator and there's the victim. And the facts are limited to the conditions that brought them together and what happened. Restorative justice or transformative justice approaches, and I want to parenthetically say here, Christopher, that not all abolitionists align themselves with restorative or transformative justice approaches, but I think 95% of them do. So the restorative or transformative justice practitioner or supporter wants to draw that lens back quite far to ask about the larger context, the conditions, the social conditions, environmental conditions, the political conditions, and to consider a wider range of individuals who are party to the conflict. I hope that answers your question, or it begins to answer it, or puts us on a different path anyway.
Right, because I think, I mean, for some people, there's the notion that the point of imprisonment or the point of any kind of penal action is to address the breakdown in justice, to return balance to justice. And there's lots of different things, or in other cases, the point of imprisonment and the like is to protect people from particularly violent people. I mean, I'm thinking of, in particular, John Paul II, when he came out against the death penalty, said, we now have means of protecting society that we didn't have before from particularly violent people. And so, and it's interesting because that was pretty much the reason that the Roman Catechism, which was done after the Council of Trent in the 16th century, that's the reason it gave for the state wielding the sword, as it were, to protect society from wrongdoers. So I think it's really to identify the purpose why we do things clarifies, in my mind, what ought to be done.
I agree. I believe that protecting society from wrongdoers is a misguided way of thinking about what should be our response to criminal wrongdoing. I do not advocate for that as a motivating incentive, nor do I believe or advocate for restoring the balance of justice in a very narrow sense as a motivator for any system of justice. And what I've tried to lay out is a different principle, a different set of principles maybe, upon which our response to wrongdoing might be founded, might be based.
Would you say that's the same thing, for instance, if someone steals $50 from me? Isn't it part of the is there a writing of justice when he's required to give me my $50 back?
I'm sorry it happens to you.
No, I didn't. It doesn't happen to me, but it's saying,
But I think I want to make myself really clear here. I'm not motivated by what we ordinarily understand to be the writing of justice. So if I were motivated by writing the injustice, I guess, then I would say, let's find a way to, he took this, let's find a way to balance those scales. He took it from you, let's find a way for him to give it back and then pay a little bit more. But that's not what I believe we should be asking ourselves when we look at a situation. Maybe can we just go a little bit further with your example? Mm-hmm. Okay. So definitely, an attributive approach to the theft of $50 would be interested in balancing those scales, making him pay it back, paying a bit more. What I'm proposing instead is that we would look at that situation and ask, what happened? What happened here? Not just what happened on Friday at 2:30 when he grabbed your wallet or whatever it was, but what's going on in this person's life? What were the circumstances? What created the impulse or the urge to do this? I'd be more interested in knowing where what happened with you. Did you have interactions with them? Did you have a previous relationship? I'd be interested in finding out what gave rise to this harm. I'd also be interested in doing what our current criminal justice system doesn't allow us to do very well, which is getting your perspective as the putative victim. One of the things that we find brings many people into the abolitionist fold is their experience as victims of crime. And you guys have probably read enough or seen enough documentaries to know how little input the current criminal justice, how little input from them the criminal justice system allows, and how circumscribed is the roles that they play within typical criminal trial, and not being able to directly talk to the person who committed that crime and so on. So I would be interested in learning from you. I'd be interested in learning from him. More to the point, I'd be interested in a system, in an approach, in a technology that provided the mechanism by which we could listen and learn from all of you and mutually come to some understanding, which sounds a lot like a restorative justice circle. There's 1,001 flavors of restorative justice circles, but I think that's generally what I'm calling for, because it will allow us better to address the harms that were revealed, not to seek justice, to address the harms such that the people emerge and our neighborhoods emerge from the process more reconciled to each other, healed, feeling heard, with accountability, and nobody has suffered except for you. I'm sorry when you lost your money.
May I interject something? There is a project. I don't know much about it, but I know some in Brazil, which is APAC, APAC, which is Association for Protection and Assistance of People in Jail, which it seems that is very close to what you are suggesting. And they begin with the idea precisely that there is human dignity in the people who are in prisons, so that they, through a long process, they find meaning to their own life. Then they recognize the wrongdoing they did, and they change their life and transform, and then they can, some of them can be incorporated in society again. But yet, if that is the case, and as you say, you are not looking for justice, giving everyone his due, rather than something else. And I'm wondering, what is that something else? Is meaning to their life of the people who are in jail? Are you looking for mercy? Or if you do that, and at the same time you are saying you are looking for a system, transformative, here, technology, but I have difficulty in believing that a system can provide that. I think human beings are more than a machine that can be fixed by a system. There should be then, you mentioned, I think, about forgiveness, about love, but how then you go about that in a society which is highly, highly secular? I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying, but
I don't understand entirely what you're saying, but I'll address those parts that I do understand from my own secular point of view, because I'm an example of that secular society.
Okay.
As a Quaker, but you know how Quakers are. Quakers are really secular. The program in Brazil sounds very meaningful and very impactful. And I have no doubt that there are individuals who go through such programs and go through programs here that are similar to that, in which individuals feel they have been transformed and that they can participate more fully in society. One of the things that I find attractive about the abolitionist approach is that it doesn't consider individuals who have hurt other people to be people in need of fixing. And its orientation is not that of rehabilitating or correcting or reforming those individuals. Its orientation is more that of better understanding the forces and the urges, both at an individual level and at a systemic level, that may have contributed to their committing acts of harm or wrongdoing, and seeking to address those. There are so many examples, but I know I talk too much, so I'm tempted to go off in a different. I don't want to go off in that direction, but I do want to say a couple of things. It's not a utopian project, which I think is kind of what you were getting at, Mario, when you talked about the not just the.
Let me say something. It's not an utopian project. What I'm saying, it may be an utopian project if you only trust in a system, because what you're describing is what we call conversion. So there is more than a system, because we are not people just react in our behavior through some stimuli and so on. You can change all the things outside, but if you don't find meaning to your life, and that comes from, generally speaking, what we call conversion. And so not only people who are in jail, people who were victims of those in jail also. In other words, if we are going to deal with this or we are going to implement this approach, it seems to me that I want to know how an approach which is only systemic can deliver that. That's my point.
I wonder if there are any approaches to transformative justice, restorative justice in the country already that are religious in nature, religious in orientation. There may well be. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. It seems like the sort of thing that many people who are religious, devout, might be drawn to, right? So I wouldn't be surprised to know, and if there are such programs and initiatives, and I'd be very curious to know how they operate. I'm not aware of that. A restorative justice or transformative justice approach does not inherently preclude faith or the role of conversion or the role of divinity in it. I tend not to speak about that because that's not my orientation. But I want to just get back to very quickly to one other thing. I think I'll stop there. Is that responsive to what you were saying, Mario? I'm sorry, I can't speak more directly.
I can give you a philosophical answer. Yes and no. Sic et non, Abelard. Yes, I understand what you are saying, but perhaps we need to define what religious really mean. What I'm saying is that could you show how effective this proposal of yours is by implementing just a system which doesn't get into provide, if I can use that word, those people a meaning to their life? Is that system enough? I'm thinking behind the Enlightenment Project. Let's reform, and this is the system, and then we have a good result. That's my point. Is that really is possible? What you say is possible, but can you show statistically that that will be the way to go?
No, I can't show statistically, but I can tell you, and I don't know how I would do that, but I can tell you that it's not simply my proposal. I mean, it is my proposal, but it's happening. This is already happening. What I am arguing for is an expansion of what is already happening, intensification of what is already happening. So let me explain that. I already, I think it was in response to your question, Mario, that there are many initiatives and projects and pilot programs and the like that have the effect of reducing the numbers of people going into the prison system and of increasing the rate of decarceration, or the rate at which people are released from the prison system, because they might be released into a program like this. Okay. So those pilot programs and initiatives are abolitionist in nature because one of their goals is to shrink down the size of the prison system, right, and the number of people in the prison system. So it's happening. I am arguing for, or pleading for, an acceptance and an interest, and more than that, and an investment in these sorts of initiatives and projects. Some of them have been subject to evaluation. others have not. Many of them are relatively new. We've, been around 5 or 6 years, and the data just isn't there yet, right? I find myself so encouraged by this trend. I would love to see every jurisdiction in the United States doing some form at the county level, at the state level, at the municipal level, providing multiple opportunities for individuals, for courts, for victims to engage in some process of this sort, such that it's tested over and over and over again, such that everybody knows somebody who has been through something like this, because unfortunately we have enough harm in society that it's quite possible that everybody could know someone who has been through something like this, that sentencing people to prison in response to wrongdoing becomes increasingly unattractive, untenable, and unwise, continue to be unwise. Such that we shrink, such that we starve the prison system. So no, I don't have data. I mean, I have data from particular programs, but I can't tell you on a national level. I haven't seen any studies on a national level, any meta-analyses of all of these programs. They're really sort of apples and oranges almost. I mean, we've got electronic monitoring over here, which some people consider, which is an alternative incarceration. We've got radical transformative justice projects here. We've got probation programs. We've got drug diversion courts. I mean, these are all ways of shrinking the passage of individuals to prisons, right? And getting them out. And it's very likely that you would not approve of or not like all of these programs, and that you might find yourself attracted to some of them because they do provide what I understand you to be looking for, which is an ability in your words to provide a sense of meaning to the individuals who are participating. I know that there are many programs and initiatives out there such as I've broadly described, that I'm not drawn to. I kind of say, yay, I'm glad you're trying that. We'll get some data out of it. But that's not what I'm so excited about. Electronic monitoring is an example of that. That's people going into prison, but I'm not a fan of electronic monitoring. Prisons are such cesspools of pain and suffering. I am very willing to try a bunch of different things, to encourage people in Louisiana who are going to do it differently than the people in New Jersey, who are going to do it differently than people on Indian reservations. Let's just try. Let's learn from each other. Let's tweak it so that we feel like we've gotten it better. Let's learn from the people who have been involved and see where we end up.
I think, Rebecca, you have a great deal to teach us. And I'm certainly learning. And as a learner, as a student in this regard, I'm taking notes. And I say that because I want to connect on 3 different levels, I think. And I just heard you use that wonderful word, meta. Don't deny it. So my first level is a meta level question. When Christopher asked something along the lines of, what's the point of punishment, or what's the purpose, or what's the nature? I heard you to say that there's no right answer to that kind of question. And the only answer is what we decide. Now, you also mentioned different periods where we made, as it were, different decisions. So we have Jeremy Bentham, utilitarian par excellence, who actually designed, I'll bet you know this, a penitentiary for the state of Illinois in the 1800s. And his idea was, of course, we want to inflict the minimal pain necessary to achieve what we need. Now, Bentham knew very well that Immanuel Kant would disagree with that kind of deterrence approach, because Kant argued that if we treat prisoners the way Bentham would treat prisoners, we're treating them as means to an end, and no person should be treated merely as a means. So Kant argued for a kind of retributivism. You did this, and we're going to punish you because you did this. Now, fast forward to some of the most turbulent periods of the last century, and we have the French philosopher Simone Weil, not to be confused with Simone de Beauvoir, but Simone Weil, who said that, in her view, the first and primary purpose of punishment was to lead the person being punished to understand the wrongness of what he or she did, to understand the wrongness of what he or she did. And of course, that way of leading the person to see the wrongness of what he or she did, that way could be multiform. There could be many ways of doing that. But now, pushing ahead. So what counts as doing something wrong? What counts as doing something wrong? Back to the meta question. Is there really no answer to that? Is it a matter of what we decide? We've decided that this is wrong, and then later we decided that it wasn't wrong. And is it just what we decide that determines what's wrong? And that leads us into all kinds of problems. One problem is in China today, it's been decided that, by whom? By the party, that it's wrong to really take Islam seriously. And the way we can get you to see that that's wrong is to put you in a camp. But of course, it's not just something that we find in the East, as it were. There are any number of people involved in revolution in Ireland. And the British government maintained that what they were doing is wrong. And it was wrong even to think about doing such a thing. So you need not be found guilty of insurrection. If there was an algorithm of sorts, that was enough. If you were the sort of person that would engage in insurrection, then you should be jailed. And that's precisely what the British government did. So at some point, it seems to me, we've got to go beyond, well, that's up to us to decide. Because I think, as you would agree, the people who do the deciding are the people in power. And of course, it's not up to us to decide whether that's the wrong way to decide. We know that that's the wrong way to decide. We know there's something wrong with that, and that goes all the way back to Socrates engaging Callicles in the nature of wrongdoing and arguing that wrongdoing is simply not a matter of what we decide. It's a matter of what is real. Now, that probably sounds philosophical. And just to show you that philosophy isn't enough, I'm going to go to a completely different end of the spectrum of discussion. And you're going to say, geez, he's fallen off the ledge. I know from personal experience the incredible damage that meth addiction causes. I know, in particular, the incredible damage that meth addiction causes to homeless people. And within the last 10 days, I think it's within the last week, there was a coordinated sting enterprise around the world. It was a global initiative, and it was to capture major top-level drug manufacturers and drug dealers. Now, I have entertained, not maliciously, mind you, I've stepped back, stepped on any hint of maliciousness, mind you, but I've entertained dispassionately the idea that if we know with certainty that someone has been manufacturing and distributing meth on a great scale, among other things, what we should do is to detain in one way or another that person. Among things that we should do in one way or another is seize the financial assets of that person. But here's another suggestion, that we tattoo on the forehead of that person the letters MM for meth murders. What do you make of that?
I would want to ask you a bunch more questions.
Ask away. But you might only have 8 minutes.
But given the
class is coming to an end, teacher.
But given the little that you've told me, I'll respond by saying, I want to go back to the first principles that I love it. Which are that when we encounter an act of wrongdoing or harm, however that's defined, and that's another, I appreciate the questions you raised about who's doing the defining. But I think for the sake of this example, we can agree that producing meth on a mass level is harmful. It's an act of wrongdoing and an act of violence that we want to address, that we feel we have jurisdiction or authority as a society to address and intervene in. Then the question is, what are the forces and the dynamics and the factors that gave rise to, in this case, I guess it's not a single victim, but there is a single perpetrator to this person's involvement and leadership in meth production and distribution and so on. You suggested 3 ways we might respond to him. You know it's going to be a him, but to them. And I would not find myself drawn to any of those 3 ways. What was the first? Detain. Well, we're going to detain in order to figure out what the next step is going to be. But if that's what you mean by detain, yes, I can sign on to that, as long as we're not talking about penal incarceration in an awful cell in a basement with no light and no window and no contact with humans. As for seizing assets, I'd want to know a lot more about what those assets were, what they are used for, and who relies on them. Because it may not be only he that suffers and is punished in the seizing of those assets. It may be their children. It may be other people that were part of the distribution of those funds that would suffer if those assets were seized, and that doesn't seem fair to me. And I just want to make a brief aside here, because I almost said that doesn't seem just to me, to explain that when I said I'm not interested in justice, I think what I tried to say was I'm not interested in the little j justice in terms of balancing the scales or getting the situation right. I am interested in larger questions of justice. To me, asking these questions, the question of what happened here, what gave rise to the harm, that's a way of approaching not balancing the scales kind of justice, but larger questions of justice. In terms of putting something on the person's forehead, I find that does not, first of all, I find it cruel. I can't believe you would suggest such a thing. But I also believe that it's not clear to me how it would respond to our desire to seek healing and reconciliation and to treat him with dignity and compassion. He's going to be stuck for the rest of his life with this tattoo. This is going to affect the way everybody engages with him until he's an old man. He is going to be, these people will respond to him with revulsion. And to assign anybody to walk through the world knowing that people will find it more difficult to extend themselves to him, to love him, that he will have a hard time finding a place to belong. That's an extraordinary step that I can't find a scenario in which it would be responsive to our desire to better understand and seek healing and an end to the harm.
Well, when I read the gospel for today, you're going to see that I'm going to be convicted by that gospel. However, I very much entertain, especially since we know that tattoos can be removed.
But then you can see all the lines. But you're right, you can remove them. You could just have pleasure in putting them on his forehead.
No, I'm considering it. Good grief. All right, now, we're coming close to the end of the hour, and I want Mario and Christopher to say a few words at least, and then we can read the gospel that convicts me.
Well, I guess I'm going first.
Go ahead.
Okay. I guess I despite my questions, I'm actually a lot more sympathetic to your position than you might think. I've often been a great proponent of restorative justice. The only difficulty I have is when you said you lost $50. Well, that's sad for you, or something like that. Well, wouldn't be terribly sad for me. I could survive the loss of $50. Some people can't survive the loss of $50, and it becomes, therefore, I think, the human mind, our way we think is that that has to be righted. Now, I realize that sort of thing can be righted through restorative justice, but I guess the difficulty I have with some of your responses, and I probably misunderstood them, was that the question of justice, even as like a bare minimum, is not important. Whereas if to promote what you want to promote, you have to take into consideration places like Tehachapi, California, where I live, or the people of rural Ohio who see things differently and who see that the point of the penal system, the point of the law enforcement is protection and the righting of wrongs. And so I think the perception that people will have, much of what you say, is that it's that canard. They care more for the perpetrator than they do for the victims. The victims are not really that important.
One minute left, Mario.
Well, the same. I would like to hear more specific about those projects, because I look at society as a whole. If you are going to offer this proposal to an administration of a particular country, you need to be more specific, because whether we like or not, any constitutional democracy is regulated by certain rules, and those rules are basically grounded in what is called justice. And that's across the board. So anyone is going to ask you, what are the specifics of your project so that we can start trying and see we can do better in this system, which seems not to be working. But I think it's a very good way of changing things.
Thank you. Today's gospel is from Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes his sun rise on the bad and the good, and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? Do not the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what is unusual about that? Do not the pagans do the same? So be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. Come, Lord Jesus, come."
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good,
This was
very good.
fantastic. I really appreciate it. See you all later.
See ya. Take care.
The mission of Holy Apostles College and Seminary is to form faithful witnesses of Christ. Year after year, the prestigious Newman Guide has recommended Holy Apostles for our academic excellence and steadfast fidelity to the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church. We are also fully accredited and the leader in Catholic online learning. Our students enjoy the unsurpassed flexibility to study on their own time and anywhere in the world through asynchronous engagement. Holy Apostles is dedicated to the relentless pursuit of truth, which allows students in all academic programs, including undergraduate, graduate, and personal interest, to formulate a coherent worldview based on both faith and reason. The study of the liberal arts also develops and refines key competencies associated with career readiness, such as critical thinking and problem solving, clear communication, collaboration, and a strong work ethic. The tuition rate at Holy Apostles is one of the most affordable in the country. Yearly tuition for a full-time undergraduate is under $12,000. Students at Holy Apostles can graduate with minimal or even no college debt, which enables them to live out their calling as faithful witnesses of Christ without heavy financial burdens holding them back. Please visit www.holyapostles.edu/admissions for more information. The Fall 2021 admissions deadline is Friday, July 23rd. Classes start Monday, August 30th. See you soon.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.